My poor little Courtney, if only he knew. How far he's come, dear. Oh, how he fought it when it happened, but now he's accepting it. It's who he is, Christina said to her sister. How did you do it? I didn't believe you, until I saw. Jen responded. Christina smiled and said, well, it started out not long ago. You know how he was back when he was the hotshot chief of police. The youngest one ever, did it before he reached 20 years on the job. He was phenomenal, but hubris caught up with him. I found out he was having an affair with one of his staff chiefs below him. She wasn't too happy with it. She was ready to sue for sexual harassment when the city found out. So the mayor called me up and told me all about it. Me and him had a pretty long-standing relationship. I'd known him for years. I used to volunteer for his campaigns when he was a councilman. It was a nice gesture on his part, so that I would be spared finding out from the press. What about? Jen interjected but was cut off by Christina. My husband would never tell me. He didn't have the balls. He was all bravado, but when a real confrontation came he hid like a scared child. No, the little coward wouldn't have it in him to confess. I asked the mayor, Tim, what are you going to do? And he said, that's why I was calling you. Then he told me that he was thinking of demoting or firing him. I was adamantly opposed to Tim firing him. Court was a year away from getting his pension. If I wanted to divorce him, I wanted to be able to get part of that. It was financially important to me for him to keep his job. I explained that to Tim, who understood my concerns. Tim told me he was going to demote my husband to some low-level desk job in one of the precincts. I was glad to hear it, and I said goodbye and thought that would be the end of it. I waited for Court to come home that night. He came in and did not say a word about the demotion I knew he received. I also knew that Tim had promoted the woman Court had harassed to police chief. Court just pretended that nothing had changed. The little pansy couldn't meet my eyes though. Finally, I had enough of him. I blurted out that the mayor called and told me about what had happened. You should have seen Court's face go white. He was pleading with me to forgive him. I couldn't. Not when he was trying to keep it a secret to protect himself. I told him that he was sleeping in the guest room that night. He understood that I couldn't stand to be with him that night. You'll never understand what I felt at that moment. I was betrayed by the man I had been faithful to for 22 years. Half my life, and he couldn't even manage the decency to tell me what he had done. At that moment I decided I would get my revenge on him. I wasn't sure what it was going to be. I considered going out and having an affair myself to make it even, but that wasn't me. I called the mayor the next day and asked him about Court's demotion. I asked if I could come in and speak out with him and the new police chief. Tim found the time for me, and I went in that day. I had a sit-down meeting with Tim and Cheryl. Cheryl? Jen asked. That's the new police chief. Very pretty for a cop, I have to give her that. Anyway, we were talking about my husband's demotion, and I told them about what his actions meant to me and the emotions they stirred. Tim was sympathetic and Cheryl was, well, out for revenge herself. I asked if there was a more demeaning job my husband could be subjected to, and Cheryl quickly said metermaid. You should have seen the mayor's face. He thought it was a little too farcical, but Cheryl convinced him quickly by rattling the cage with a lawsuit threat. Tim wants to be governor someday, so he's a little sensitive to claims by aggrieved women. So I left his office after the agreement was made. I waited for Court with such eagerness. I wanted to see his face when walked in. He was going from police chief to a male metermaid. When he came in, his face looked like slate. All of his bravado was gone. He came over to me and asked if it was all right if he could speak with me. I nodded but was unwilling to look at him. I'll never forget his words, Christina, they demoted me to a metermaid. I had to really fight to keep from smiling. I just responded, oh. Court continued, I have to wear a skirt. You should have seen how fast my head jerked in his direction. I started to laugh. He said it wasn't funny. I didn't see his point, so I continued. When I calmed down, he told he was being placed in the city's historical district where they made the metermaids dress in a more old-fashioned way for the tourists. Then, he told me about the dress code there. He had to wear a navy blue blouse and jacket, a cap, a slightly below-the-knee skirt, navy blue stockings or nude pantyhose, and shoes with a 1-inch heel. I almost died. What did he have to say about? Jen asked. He told me he went to 2 attorneys after his shift ended. He told them he was being made an example of and wanted to sue for gender discrimination, but they told him he had no case. The dress code applied equally. He was being treated equally, not specially. So then, he told me he wanted to quit. I asked about his pension. He said he was prepared to work the rest of his life to avoid being a meter maid. I had none of it. I scolded him. It was his fault he was where he was, and I wasn't about to let him risk the financial stability of our family, especially given that our daughter is in college. I told him that it would be good for him. I told him to consider it penance for his sin. He broke quickly. He went outside and came back in carrying his new uniforms. I couldn't wait to see him in it, but he was reluctant to model it. I told him that he should let me get a look at him so I could help him look more womanly. He was convinced quickly, after he realized that he might look like a man wearing woman's clothing, which some don't take too well. I asked if he knew how to put on the hosiery, and he said that one of the girls at the quartermaster told him how to do it. I smiled and told him to go on and get dressed. When he came out dressed, I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing at him. He was Court in a skirt. The male hair, the lack of makeup. I pulled him in front of a mirror and said, Court, do you think you look good? He shook his head, and I pulled him into the bathroom. I took off his cap and totally made up his face. Eyeliner, lipstick, blush, mascara. They brought out the delicate features that had attracted me to him in the first place. You liked it, didn't you? You were always into those glam metal bands when we're kids, Jen added. Christina nodded and responded, yes, and no. I liked his face, but the clothing was a real turn-off. The metal guys just wore blouses and spandex, not tights and skirts. I told him to sit there and I went into my closet and pulled out an old Halloween wig from that year I went to your costume party as Madonna. Oh, my God! That platinum blonde wig? Jen blurted out. Christina raised her eyebrows and smiled before she said, you should have seen him grimace when I walked in with it. I placed it on his head and put his cap back on, which secured it in place. He just stared in the mirror vacantly for a moment. It was as if he could not believe that he was the woman staring back at him. He wasn't an especially attractive woman. He was a little pugly, but no one would think he was anything but a woman if he didn't speak. I asked him what he thought, and he told me he was disgusted by how he looked. His father had to be turning over in his grave as his son was sitting dressed so believably as a meter maid. I comforted him with a hand on his shoulder and told him that it was good that he looked so womanly. I said that, at least, now, no one would mistake you for a man. When I told him that I couldn't even mistake him for a man, he cringed. He was reading into it that I didn't consider him one anymore. He was right, but it was not the skirt that made him less than a man. It was his cowardice and submissiveness. He brought everything on himself and had screwed me over, so I had no pity. I told him he needed to raise his voice. He asked me for clarification, so I told him to speak in a higher tone. He tried to get it right, but he sounded ridiculous. So I told him to speak with an accent as he raised his voice higher. I had him working with a little southern accent. He sounded like a belle in no time. He went and showered and went to bed in the guest bedroom while I laid in bed in mine. The next morning, you would have loved how frightened he was. The closer it got for him to leave the door all dressed up, the more hesitant and horrified he seemed to get. But I had none of it. I practically pushed him out the door, which made him scurry to his car with mincing steps in the hopes of avoiding being seen by the neighbors. When he came back home, he was a beaten man. How so? Jen interrupted. Let me tell you. His eyes had this sadness in them. He told me that all the girls he worked with were being rude to him. They all knew what he had done with Cheryl. Court was so used to having his ass kissed by all his subordinates, and now he was being disrespected by the lowest rung of the department. His ego was gone. The pretend alpha male he was gone. He knew it was gone forever. In the department he would always be known as the tranny meter maid. There was no going back for him. He was practically crying, saying it's horrible, they all call me Courtney. I couldn't help but snicker and respond, Courtney, I rather like that name. I've been calling him it ever since. At first he resented it and tried to stop me from saying, but after a few weeks he gave up. The more humiliated he became, the more satisfied I was. One day he practically broke down in front of me. He saw a robbery taking place, but he said he was helpless to do anything. I told him that he shouldn't take it badly. He's a dainty thing. He couldn't be expected to take on big, male robbers. He practically cried when I said that. I didn't want to see that, so I asked him why he didn't pull his gun. Then, he told me he's not allowed to carry one. They made him turn it in. That just emasculated him more. He told me when the cops came they spoke down to him. They were calling him miss, though he knew that they knew who he was. I explained to him that he couldn't fault them based on how he looked. I mean, who would call him sir, I explained. I think that was the turning point for him. He stopped complaining about his job. He would tell me about his day, but he seemed to realize that he was just another girl writing tickets from then on. He realized that he wasn't a man at home either. Originally he would come home and change into his male clothes, but he never left the house in pants. After I had his fingernails painted, it was an impossibility anyway. Sometimes he would ask if he could come back into the master bedroom, but I kept telling him I wasn't ready. Eventually, he gave up. He accepted that the guest room was his for the foreseeable future. It was at that point that he basically gave up wearing men's clothes altogether, sticking to a largely asexual wardrobe off-duty around the home. What did Rosanna think of all this? Jen asked. Christina responded, I didn't tell her when she was away at college. I figured she'd find out when she came home for summer break. When she got home, Court was out at work and I told her about what had happened. She thought I was joking at first. Then, I showed her father's uniforms and she began to believe me. I think she was more upset about his cheating on me than his cross-dressing. She wanted to see him. She needed confirmation. So I decided the time was right to visit Courtney on the job. We headed downtown and set out to find him. Sure enough, we saw him. He was driving around on one of those glorified golf carts. The truth set in for Rosanna at that moment. She turned away from him and pulled me out of his potential view. She asked me, "What do I say to Daddy?" I told her she could wait until he got home if she wanted. Although, I counseled her against calling him Daddy. She understood and decided that she would confront him. I walked with her most of the way, but stood a good 10 feet away from her as Court put a ticket under some car's windshield wipers. The horrified look on his face was priceless. He knew she was coming home, but he didn't know that she was coming home then. "How could you?" she screamed. Courtney responded with the breathy southern accented voice that had become second nature to him, "I'm so sorry." She turned away from him and walked towards me. They both gave me hurt looks. Only Rosanna's concerned me. Court had it coming. Rosanna was innocent. It took 2 weeks for Rosanna to say 2 words to Courtney. I kept talking to her and trying to convince her to make up with him. I told her that I was still mad at him, but it shouldn't come between her and him. I couldn't forgive him yet, but she could and should. And she did. A few days after that, she brought her new boyfriend, Eric, by as Court came home from work. She introduced me to Eric as her mother, and Courtney as Aunt Courtney. I found it amusing to watch the strapping boy kiss Courtney on the cheek. Court was red with embarrassment. I bet he was. Being kissed by his daughter's boyfriend. The boy's supposed to be afraid of the girl's overprotective father, Jen declared. Not this one. Are you talking about me? Rosanna said as she entered the room. Yes, dear. We were talking about when you saw your father for the first time downtown, answered Christina. Oh, I was pissed, Rosanna said. What was it that you got to you most? Jen asked as Christina excused herself to start cooking dinner. It was the cheating and the lying. I could handle him being in skirts. It doesn't bother me anymore. At first, I was a little creeped out about my dad wearing a skirt and pantyhose, but that passed. It really doesn't bother you? Jen probed. No. He's more effeminate than I realized. You'll see it when comes home. He's not some kind of he-she looking thing. He's decidedly feminine. So you think he's a good-looking girl? Jen asked. For a man, yes. I would put him as below average for a woman. Probably a 4. That's good for a guy. I'm not saying it's not, but when he comes back don't expect to be looking at Kate Beckinsale. Come on, practically no woman is Kate Beckinsale. Well, you're right about that. I've got to ask you, Rosanna. How are you taking what your mother has done to him? Rosanna shrugged and said, I don't really know. On the one hand, I can't blame her. He deserved to be punished, but I don't know if I would have done the same thing if I was in her position. I think I would have just divorced him, but then again I have never been married. I think there's some love still there in her. How can you think that? Jen said in a voice louder than she intended. Rosanna took a deep breath and said, I think Mom likes what she's done to him. When he's in those girls' pants she bought him, she gives him lusty looks. I like to think it's love, but I don't know. She says she doesn't like him in skirts, but she loves to dominate him. He's definitely submissive. That took me some time to understand. I mean, I got it right away, but I had trouble accepting that he's really that way. I mean, how would you react if you came home and found that your parents were engaged in a dominatrix subtype of relationship? I would be nauseated. Yes. That was how I responded initially. I guess the reality of it makes you accept it a little more each day. Do you really think that's the way they are? Jen asked. Rosanna nodded and said, I don't have any doubts anymore. Mom takes pleasure in humiliating him, and he just takes it. Sometimes, I wish he'd fight back. I wish he'd man up and try to fix their relationship, rather than let her call all the shots, but I know he won't. He's not that guy. He doesn't have it in him. I think I heard a car, Jen interjected. That's him, Christina shouted into the room. I don't know if I'm ready to see Courtney, Christina, Jen shouted to her sister. Don't worry. You won't laugh at him given how he looks now, Rosanna interjected. The door swung open, and a womanish figure strolled through the door. After closing the door, Court paused as he saw the face of his sister-in-law silently staring at him. Jen was surprised by how good Courtney did look. He was a passable woman. She had been uncertain if her sister and niece had been telling her the truth. Jen turned to her sister who had joined them by the door. Christina winked at her sister who looked back at her with a look of astonishment. Christina smiled and said, Courtney, you and Jen go into the dining room and get acquainted. I'm going to finish up dinner, so I expect you to entertain her. Court nodded dutifully and led Jen back into the dining room. How are you? Jen asked as she sat. Court stared back at her blankly. He looked down at his uniform resting over his fake breasts. His fingertips touched the bottom of the strands of hair coming from his wig. He looked back up at Jen without saying a word. Jen smiled and nodded before adding, How are you taking it? Okay, I guess. That's not what Rosanna told me. What did she say? She said you've taken to your role. If you want to call it that, I guess. I'm dealing with it. I've got to. This isn't going to change for a while. Why are you doing it? Why didn't you just quit? I couldn't destroy my family's financials. A man's got to do what he's got to do to keep his family afloat. Even if you'd never know he was a man? Ha, ha, Court responded in a sarcastic laugh to hide the pleasure the dig had given him. Sorry. I don't want to humiliate you. I just think you've gotten more out of it than you really deserve. Court shrugged and said, I don't know. I really screwed up. I would have left her if she did what I did. So, I guess, this is not that bad. Not that bad? You're in a skirt. In public. I know. I was definitely humiliated at first. I felt like less than a man the moment I put on the uniform and turned in my gun. I could have puked the first time I put the uniform on. It felt wrong. Jen, noticing the pause, interjected, but what? It felt wrong, but I felt kind of turned on by the hose. Jen gave Court an askew look and said, You like it. Don't you? No. I don't. I don't like wearing a skirt. I don't like wearing girls' shoes. I don't like my wig or my fake breasts. It's just a little comfortable. That's what disturbs me most about this. I'm not humiliated about it anymore. Everyone who could know, knows. I'm a departmental laughingstock. My daughter sees me dressed like a girl 24 hours a day, and so does my wife. I've accepted that I'm a woman in the world for a little while longer. Do you think you could go back? Jen asked. Court took a deep breath and said, I could go back to being a man. I wouldn't be the one I was though. I've been working on making myself more girly, and it's ingrained in me. I cross my legs without thinking about it. I talk with this stupid southern girl voice whenever I open my mouth. I have to consciously try to talk normally. I'll never be a regular guy again. God knows what I am to Rosanna and Christina. Am I her other mother? Am I Christina's wife? What am I? I'm still a parent to Rosanna, but will she ever see me as daddy again? With Christina, forget it. I don't even think she considers me her spouse. I don't think she feels I'm her husband. I'm just this woman living in her home that she has dinner with. You don't think she'll ever forgive you? Jen asked. I don't know. I don't know if she can. I don't think it would make any difference. Look at me. Would you ever be able to think of a guy as your husband if he went to work like this on any day other than Halloween? I think of you as my husband, Christina interjected. How can? Christina cut her husband off and said, You're a bit of a sissy, but you're my husband nonetheless. I can't escape that. If I didn't think we could make it work, I would have shown you the door the day you came home with that uniform. I hate seeing you wear it. I do, but it's for the best. At least now I know you're not cheating on me because I'm sure I'm the only girl attracted to your pansy ass. Court smiled before he asked, If you don't like it, then why do I have to dress like a girl around here? You're not in skirts or dresses. That's all that matters to me. I don't mind you dressing effeminately. In fact, I do make you do so, and will until the day one of us dies. You're never going to wear distinctly men's clothing again as long as you're married to me. I don't quite understand. Let me be clear. I like effeminate men. I don't like girls. If you want to stay married to me, you're going to be a sissy going forward. Am I clear? Yes, Court said as he looked down. Christina shook her head and said, I need to know now if you can live with that. If you can't, we might as well end this now. A broken voice, resembling Court's former male tone, crept from Court's lips. I can accept that. Christina leaned towards her husband and kissed his cheek. Court smiled slightly at his wife's first sign of affection in a long time. As she walked away to help Rosanna put the finishing touches on their dinner, Court's smile faded as he realized that theirs was no longer a marriage of equals. His former assertiveness was gone. As Jen left to freshen herself up, Court was left to ponder what he had become. He touched his fake breasts with his painted fingernails and realized that he was a spineless sissy. He would never be able to stand up to his wife. She would control him for the rest of their lives. He blushed out of shame as he realized how turned on it was all making him.